Hello, everyone, and welcome into another episode of the Crowded Booth Podcast. Bryce Koon alongside longtime guest and lurker of the show, Palmer Thombs, and I do know that he lurks around because the Palmer, it's well documented. The Georgia Tech fans have a love-hate relationship with you after you came on. I think it was last fall or last December to talk about the addition of Buster Faulkner. They were when I
Yeah.
told them that you were going to be doing the Georgia preview, they were actually excited to see what you had to say, hoping you'd throw in some kind words. But hey, man, we appreciate you having on the show. It was good to catch up with you in Nashville. But man, how are you feeling now that kind of I don't want to say talking season is over, but a big portion of it is, and we're about 30 something days from playing football.
Yeah, I mean, as we record this, we're just over a week away from the start of fall camp in Athens. It's an exciting time. I mean, it was fun to, like you said, to run into some folks that we all know and get to interact with throughout football season, and that's kind of your kickstart. It's you spend your summer, you get your time in with friends and family, and then all of a sudden media days comes around, and it's a reminder of these are the people that you're going to spend the next couple of months with, for better or for worse. So it's fun. I'm excited about this season. Third year with DawgsHQ. Georgia is 2 for 2 with DawgsHQ, and we'll see what they can do if they can pull off a three-peat and accomplish something that hasn't been done since the 1930s.
Yeah, look, we heard that question asked so much in the ballroom to Kirby Smart. Expectations. The three-peat. Do you talk about it? All these different kind of things. And look, I mean, we could sit here and have a whole podcast episode on are they going to three-peat? But I mean, the fact of the matter is it's a new team. It's a new team, a lot of new faces that are going to take the field. Palmer, I imagine that's kind of the message being spoke to this team too. Says, hey, look, I think Kirby did it last year. I watched the documentary that came out with SEC Network. It was well done. But just kind of talking about those guys won it last year, but this is still a bunch of guys, and we're going to talk about some names that really haven't proven a lot in a Georgia uniform or coming from somewhere else. Is that the kind of the same message that you're hearing and you're feeling, where it's a bunch of new guys and he's trying to encourage them to be hungry and say, look, you haven't proved anything yet?
Man, I thought you were going to throw me the "is Georgia going to three-peat" question 2 minutes into this podcast. No, I mean, it is the same message. I think that when you look at Georgia going into the 2022 season, coming off of that first championship, they had a lot of new faces. And there are new faces this year. There's less of them, though. And I think what maybe differentiates the two is the importance of those new faces. Obviously, it starts at quarterback with replacing Stetson Bennett. But on the defensive line, I mean, you're not replacing 3 guys, but you're replacing a big guy in Jalen Carter.
Mm-hmm.
You're replacing an All-American safety in Christopher Smith. So you're not having to replace the numbers per se, but the guys that you're replacing have been big figures, not only just for this most recent championship team, but for the previous one too. So I think that, yes, the message is, still about complacency, still about being hungry, still about being the hunter, not the hunted. But I think that, with this team, you've got a lot of guys that have some experience, definitely more so than you did last year. You've got a lot of guys that understand what it takes to win a championship. Kirby talked about it at SEC Media Days, but the heart of this team, the upperclassmen on this team have seen 2 championships. They've experienced it. They know what it takes to get to that level, and they're going to bring along the younger guys with them. So, like I said, excited to see how they go about replacing some of those key pieces, and I know that's something that we're going to talk about here.
Yeah, let's start defensively, because a guy that comes to mind for me when you talk about defensive leadership and just overall a team leader is a guy like Nolan Smith, who obviously went down with injury last year, a fan favorite, no doubt. But when you
Absolutely.
look at a guy that is needing to step up and maybe shoulder some of that, you have your guys that are vocal leaders, you have your guys that lead by example. We're going to get into specific positions. Is it a guy on that front 7, or is it someone on the back end? I mean, who do you think kind of assumes that maybe that heart and soul of what it means to be a defender playing for Georgia right now?
Yeah, I mean, and Nolan is absolutely one of those guys that they're replacing a first-round pick to the Philadelphia Eagles, the Georgia Eagles up there, up in Philadelphia. That defense with 5 guys. The Athens is going to be watching the Eagles this year for sure. But you're right. It did feel like they had to replace him. that they already went about replacing him because of
Mm.
the 8 games that he missed at the end of the season. Outstanding start to the season with 7 tackles for loss in 7 games. Got injured in that Florida contest and then was out for the year. Georgia went about replacing him. And I think that, where you're replacing him more now, they went about replacing him on the field that second half of the season. Now, they did have Robert Beal, who is going to also have to be replaced this year in that outside linebacker room. But Chaz Chambliss stepped into that spot on the field. It's off the field that you're going to have to replace him. It's that intangible leadership type stuff because he was still around. He was still a very important part of Georgia's championship runs. You saw him in his sling, on the sideline, waving the towel, getting hype with his boys on the defensive side of the ball, celebrating and supporting and, being a coach. Kirby talked about that, after Nolan's injury, was that they had to sit down and was like, hey, man, we need you still. We need you to be around this team. We need you, don't check out on us. So they're going to have to replace him from a leadership perspective. And, a couple of guys, I don't look at that defensive front as much as I do the secondary because of the guys that are back there and returning. Javon Bullard and Kamari Lassiter are 2 guys that I look to. Guys that stepped into, this time last year, we were talking about them as, new figures and new faces in those important places, having to step up and be, key players for this team. Well, nobody was bigger for Georgia down the stretch than Javon Bullard. I mean, just look at the way that he finished that national championship game with 2 interceptions, a fumble recovery, all in the first half, keep in mind, because he had to leave with a shoulder injury. Still won defensive MVP, won it in the Peach Bowl the game before that. Those 2 guys are very much, the heart and soul of what it means to be a Georgia Bulldog. And, they use the phrase eating off the floor. And that's kind of one of those mottos that they're talking about this year. They understand that, you can't feel like you're better than, you can't feel like you are better, that something belongs to you, that you've earned anything at this point, because it's a fresh slate. 2023, what you did the past 2 years doesn't matter. And so this team, they're still hungry. They still want to have that dog mentality. And those 2 guys really embody it. And I say I wouldn't pick somebody in that defensive front. You've got leaders in the linebacker room. Jamon Dumas-Johnson and Smile Munden were your 2 leading tacklers last year. They're probably going to be without Smile to start the season for a little while as he makes his way back from a foot injury. And then on that defensive line, there are incredible players. There's veteran guys up there in the middle. Zion Logue is a guy that I look to there. But, in terms of just having that dog in them, it's those 2 guys on the back end that I really look to, because that's what it felt like that they lost in Nolan Smith.
For Georgia fans, there's a lot of names to be excited about. Watching Malachi Starks in his second year in the red and black is going to be a lot of fun for Georgia fans. You mentioned Kamari Lassiter. You mentioned Munden and Dumas Johnson. Jalen Walker, another name. Marvin Jones Jr., that we got to see in spurts, obviously, last year. If there's a guy, Palmer, that people maybe are not talking about, didn't make maybe an all SEC list or anything like that, but that internally maybe the program's really excited about, maybe this staff feels like is going to have a big year on that defensive side of the football, maybe who are you watching out for, that a guy that is going to be could maybe show up on some list at the end of the season that's not on them right now?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, there's so many guys that you can talk about and you can go that direction with. I look at that cornerback spot opposite of Kamari Lassiter because of who they're replacing. They're replacing somebody that was, again, such a big figure in that first national championship game, maybe made the biggest play in Georgia football history. Keely Ringo having to be replaced there. Those guys have really competed. Dalen Everett is somebody that Kirby was really high on last year as a freshman. Nyland Green was an incredibly talented player coming out of high school who has played his part, battled some injuries, been an important special teamer. Julian Humphrey is somebody that also was a freshman last year and didn't come in early, so didn't get quite nearly as much buzz as Everett did, but they are competing for that spot. So I look at those guys. On the defensive line, I mean, Nazir Stackhouse got first team votes, got the first team nod on the defensive line, but I still feel like he's a little bit underrated because when you look at that defensive line and people are talking about, oh, they've got so much to replace. They lose Jalen Carter, Michael Williams is a guy that can step up. a lot of times I feel like Nazir Stackhouse gets forgotten, and what he did without Jalen Carter, during that stretch of the season where Jalen was battling some injuries, missed a couple of games. Him and Warren Brinson both played really, really well. Brinson, battled some injuries as well and played that best football when they needed him to with no Jalen Carter there. So there are breakout type guys on that defense. I look at that cornerback spot because of its importance. And then, sticking in the secondary, someone else I would throw in there, two more names I would throw in there. Tyke Smith is somebody that fans remember, tore his ACL in that 2021 season. People had high hopes for him coming into that year, transferring from West Virginia, where he was an All-American. He is finally back to full strength, played last year. But everyone always says that second year after the ACL is when you start to feel really comfortable. You've built up that conditioning, you've built up that strength. Now it's about comfort. And so, and you're not really thinking about it nearly as much in your second year removed. So he's somebody who had a really strong spring. And then I think that they're looking to a true freshman there as well. Janelle Aguero, somebody that can step in, as Bullard makes that move from star to safety. Maybe, a guy like Aguero is somebody that can step up at safety and then push him back to star. And then you've got that veteran presence there with Tyke Smith as well. So I know you asked for one. I gave you more than that, but that's what I'm good for.
Well, and two, you mentioned obviously our show. I might be living in Baton Rouge, but we still have a lot of people who watch out of that Columbus, Georgia area. Anytime you mention the name Michael Williams, what he was able to do down the stretch,
Two
a
sacks
lot of
in the
people
college
excited.
football playoffs.
Exactly. What he's able to bring to the table. But I like what you said about Nazir Stackhouse. Because of the names that have come through Athens the past and left and gone to the NFL and made an impact over the past 2-3 seasons, first off, it feels like Stackhouse has been there for 10 years, but it also is one of those things between him, Logue, and Brinson. That's a ton of experience that you're going to be having. All guys have played, obviously, multiple years. Logue, the redshirt senior, and then Stackhouse and Brinson, both seniors as well. But I like what you said. I think a lot of people are excited to also see what can this defense look like? And, a lot of people are going to be hoping that it's not as good as past years, but I think that front seven has a chance to be pretty nasty. We flip it over now to the offensive side of the football. And Palmer, I'm not going to lead off with the question that you think I'm going to lead off with. We're not talking about the quarterback position. You came on in the spring practice. But I want to know about receivers because whoever's playing quarterback has to have weapons to throw to. Now, you and I were talking before the show about how Georgia, obviously everyone knows, ran a lot of two tight end sets. Like, I don't know the data points on it, but it was one of those things where it felt like they were doing it, and for good reason. Darnell Washington goes to the NFL. Brock Bowers, he was my vote for SEC Offensive Player of the Year, just what he can bring to the table. But when you look at what they're going to maybe schematically line up as, you have it obviously offensive coordinator. I don't want to say new to Georgia fans. He's not really new, Mike Bobo. But you obviously new old and a new old.
Referred to it.
It's not brand new, but they go in the portal and they bring in Thomas and Dominic Lovett. You figured both of those guys can play a role. Lovett maybe more than others. But what is schematically this going to look like? Are they going to, line up, an Oscar Delp, a Pierce Spurlin, maybe Lawson Lucky? Are they going to expect that much out of young guys? Or is this going to be more wide receiver heavy, maybe more than we've seen in recent years at Georgia?
It's definitely going to be more wide receiver heavy. And when you've got a guy like Brock Bowers, who is so versatile, and you can move him out from that traditional tight end spot, split him out and essentially use him as a wide receiver where you're isolating, a mismatch out there in space. It's dangerous. It's going to be really exciting to see what Mike Bobo can do because you've got him, you've got Lad McConkey back, you've got Dominic Lovett, you've got Thomas, you've got Marcus Rosemy, Jack Saint. That's 5 guys that finished in the top 5 for an SEC squad last year. Obviously you do lose Darnell Washington. Kenny McIntosh was an important pass catcher for Georgia last year as well. And I don't know that they have the guy to replace either of those in those respective position groups. There's not a 6'8", 280-pound tight end. Those things don't come along that often. Darnell is a freak show because of that. So Georgia's not going to run 2 tight end sets. They're going to be more wide receiver heavy. They're going to be split out. And I think that that's probably a good thing considering You're very confident in the offensive line. You don't need an extra tight end body in there to help pass protect. Because you feel like you've got those guys. And look, they feel confident in those younger tight ends. Oscar Delp, Lawson Lucky, Pierce Sperlin, like you said. Lawson had an incredible spring. The kind of spring that you see that we saw out of Brock Bowers, the kind of spring that you really want to see. Oscar Delp has had a similar spring when he was a freshman and flashed that at times last year. Obviously stepped up in the Peach Bowl when Washington went down with an injury and played the entirety of that second half and prepared for the national championship game like he was going to have to play too. Remember talking to him out in LA and Todd Hartley and what that week looked like for him getting ready. But I think that because of the offensive line confidence, the lack of a 6'8", offensive tackle type tight end, you're going to see them spread it out more. And I also think that you're going to see them spread it out more because they don't have the depth at running back to just ground and pound you away. I mean, they're come into camp with 3 scholarship running backs that are healthy, and those 3, one of them missed. One of them missed time in the spring. One of them is a true freshman that hasn't taken a snap, and one of them was banged up in the spring, battling injuries. So every running back, all 5 of those running backs, there's some sort of injury concern or experience concern with them. So maybe you don't want to, obviously Kirby Smart and his brand of football, he wants to be physical. He wants to be able to wear on teams. And especially early in the season, wants to be able to get out of some of these games quicker, and not have to run as many plays. But they may have to. And I think that that's fine because you're going to learn a lot about those quarterbacks being able to spread it out. You've got the weapons to do it. And I think that, there's a lot of reasons that you can be excited about. You can learn a lot about your team, spreading it out and seeing what kind of potential you have with this space. I mean, like I said, your first 3 receivers are probably going to be Dominic Lovett, who transferred in from Missouri, led the Tigers in receiving there last year and was an outstanding player. I mean, had one heck of a game against Georgia. And if he didn't get hurt against Georgia, Georgia may not win that game, up there in Columbia, because they almost didn't win it without him. Lad McConkey, who finished second on the team in receiving behind Brock Bowers. Those 2 guys are so versatile that you can interchange them a little bit. They're going to play inside. They're going to play outside. And then you've got a guy who's incredibly reliable like Marcus Rosemy-Jack Saint, a great blocker, so you do have a run blocking presence out there, but a reliable, proven pass catcher. I mean, somebody that stepped up, in a time of need last year, really, provided a solid presence there on the outside. So those are probably your top 3, but then you've got a lot of potential behind them. Arian Smith is a guy that if you could get 15 games out of him, there might not be anybody on this team that Kirby would want to get 15 games out of more than Arian Smith. If he was assured 15 games of a healthy Arian Smith, it'd be incredible to watch how Georgia would use him. I don't think that they're going to do that. They're going to do maybe a little bit more than they did last year because he was coming back off of an injury that he suffered in fall camp. So they had to bring him along a little bit slower and be precautionary with him. I still think that they're going to be precautionary with him because I hate to use the word fragile, but he's kind of got a track record of being fragile, and you need to be careful with him. But if you can get him out in space, we saw what that looks like against Ohio State. Ra Thomas, like I said, somebody that led Mississippi State in receiving. And then Dylan Bell is another guy, a sophomore that they are really excited about. There's a lot of potential in that pass catching group. And oh, by the way, Brock Bowers is still the best player in college football.
Yeah, and I'll tell you right now, if Arian Smith has the season that he hopes to have, he can put that soundbite right there in his hype video at the end of the year with Palmer Thombs saying he's fragile. No, but in all seriousness, you mentioned a lot there with the offense. I think the last thing I want to talk about is this offensive line. Look, Georgia obviously benefited when running the football last year of having essentially another offensive lineman out there in Darnell Washington. Is there a concern, even though you have a veteran group there, is there a concern of the effectiveness of running the football when you combine the fact, like you said, kind of where this running back room is, and then not having that extra guy or not really having a tight end that can go out and is maybe a blocking first guy? Or is that just not, is that just something that is just on the outside looking in?
Honestly, Bryce, I think we'll have to wait and see because we haven't seen Georgia play without Darnell Washington since 2019. And, that 2019 season, they had an incredible blocking tight end in Charlie Warner. I would imagine somebody is going to have stepped up as a great blocking tight end option. John Fitzpatrick was another one, that came down the line. Over these last few years, Georgia has proven that it is tight end you. It is going to establish these guys as pass catching options and and with the ability to block, and that's something that they take pride in. Those receivers take pride in blocking, like I said with Marcus Rosemy, Jack Saint. I think that they'll find options, but we're kind of in a wait and see mode, especially early in the season, because like I said, Kendall Milton is somebody that missed part of spring with a hamstring issue. Kirby said that he is full speed going into fall camp, but he's somebody that you probably want to be careful with. And if you could unleash him, we saw what that could look like at the end of the last season, finished the season really strong. Averaged over 9 yards carry, I think, down the stretch, and was just an incredible, he's a big bruising back that's got the speed, can catch the ball out of the backfield. If you could, and I said Arian Smith is probably the one that he would want 15 games. Kendall Milton is the competition there. Dejan Edwards, being the other running back, both those guys being seniors, they're a 1-2 punch, and you want to have both 1 and 2. Dejan was a little bit banged up this spring, did play in the spring game, but you want to be careful because you don't want to burn one of those guys early in the season, because you've got Branson Robinson that's coming into the season with a foot injury, like Smile Munden. They both suffered it late in spring practice, missed the spring game, and their timelines are very similar. Could it mean that they missed time early in the season? They're not going to be full go for the start of fall camp. So that's as far as we know there. I do think that we probably are going to not see either of them in that season opener on September 2nd. So, no Branson Robinson. What's behind him? Andrew Paul is coming off of an ACL injury that he suffered last year, so he's never taken a college snap, and neither has Roderick Robinson, who's a true freshman from California. So, again, I think Georgia's offense is going to look a little bit more wide receiver heavy, pass heavy. And again, with the quarterbacks, and I might add in, with a quarterback that's not nearly as mobile as what Stetson Bennett was, you're probably going to see more of the traditional drop back, play action passing game, as opposed to, an RPO type situation where you left that up to the quarterback to have an option to, keep it himself. So going to be very interesting to see. I do think that offensive line, especially in the interior, you feel very confident in the ability of them to move guys up the middle. Cedric Van Pran, Tate Ratledge, Xavier Truss there in the middle, Amarius Mims on the outside, likely at right tackle with the competition there at left, Austin Blasky and Ernest Green competing for that job. Georgia will rotate its offensive linemen. They'll play more than 5. They played 7, more than 30% of snaps last year. I don't know that we'll see it quite reach 7 this year, but definitely 6.
I like what you had to say there. And also that is also Palmer Thombs saying right now that Carson Beck's probably the starting quarterback. We don't need to talk about it, but that's where things are obviously pointing. Hey, when I look at the schedule, Palmer, I'm not going to nitpick it. I'm actually in the camp of folks saying they couldn't help it because of what happened with this schedule. But when you look at this, obviously you're not going to have to leave. You're going to have a great, travel trip this year, by the way, because until you get to the bye week in October 21st, your road trips are going to be to Auburn. Not a bad drive, just down I-85.
Which I think that we might be doing a day trip for.
You can make, yes, exactly. You can make that in a day. And then you get to go home, potentially, to go to Nashville. So that's going to be a lot of fun for you. But obviously they play Florida in Jacksonville. I guess the game that people are going to circle here is the game up in Knoxville. But my thing is you're going to know really what this Tennessee team is by the time you get to November 18th. Is the game at Ole Miss, or the game against Ole Miss in Athens, is that going to be maybe the biggest potential upset factor when you talk about just home games. You get Kentucky, South Carolina comes in. When you look at this schedule, a lot of people, I mean, I think the over-under was like 11 something wins, maybe 10 and a half,
11 and
11
a
and a half
half.
wins, 11 and a half. Take the put your diploma down. I know you got it behind you. When you put the diploma down here, I mean, what are your thoughts on this in all seriousness? I mean, does this team, is there a game that really makes you nervous on this schedule, maybe on the home side of things?
On the home side of things, no. I mean,
Mm.
with what they get in the non-conference schedule, again, having to replace Oklahoma and doing so with Ball State at home, it's not something that really is concerning. UT Martin, Ball State, UAB are your non-conference home games. You don't have a marquee matchup. Your Power 5 matchup is against Georgia Tech late in the season, where one, you will know a lot about your team already, and two, it is kind of a home game. I mean, there you go. There you go.
Georgia Tech fans, the Georgia Tech fans that made it this far into the show, I've now tuned off. Off.
There you go, Tech fans. No, but I think that South Carolina game early in the season is going to be interesting because you're looking at a South Carolina squad that finished last season with a ton of momentum and could start this year with a ton. I mean, that game in Charlotte against North Carolina already announced as College game day. You win that. I mean, you're looking at, I don't know if South Carolina is going to be a preseason top 25 team, and I don't know if North Carolina will be either. But I think the winner of that game is probably going to end up in the top 25, and you could be looking at a top 25 matchup there, already announced as the CBS game of the week. Mm-hmm. That's an exciting one because of the momentum that South Carolina and Shane Beamer have, and a little bit of the bad blood that there seems to be between Kirby and Shane there. And then I look at that Auburn game. I mean, it's that first road game of the season. You may not know what you have in your quarterback until they are faced with a tough crowd there at Jordan-Hare Stadium. So, I think that's a situation that you could learn a lot about. Hugh Freeze is somebody that's familiar with Kirby Smart, beat him in the only matchup that they've had at Georgia. Ole Miss being the only team that Kirby has yet to beat, coming off of that 2016 loss to Hugh and company there in Oxford, a beatdown there that first season.
Yeah.
So I look at that game. I mean, that's somebody that knows what Kirby does and could give him some trouble. I look at Lane Kiffin and knows what Kirby does and could give him some trouble late in the year, but I think that Georgia will have things figured out by then. They play pretty well at home. I would be surprised to see them lose. I would be surprised to see them lose any game other than in Knoxville. And I mean, if you're asking me for a prediction on that 11.5 number, I'd go over. I think Georgia's going to go 12-0 again. I do think that they're going to beat Tennessee. They've got a system and a defense that gives that Josh Heupel system some trouble. They understand it just like Lane Kiffin and Hugh Freeze understand how to scheme against Kirby. Kirby knows how to scheme against Josh Heupel and that team because he saw him at Missouri. He saw him at Tennessee now. Mm-hmm. That's somebody that Kirby and this staff is familiar with. That they put a bunch of time and effort into them last year. They put a bunch of time and effort into them in the offseason. That's a team that does things a little bit differently. So they prepare a little bit for them in the offseason. So, I do think Georgia's going to go 12-0. They get a lot of breaks on that schedule. They don't have to play Alabama or LSU, the two favorites in the West. Mm-hmm. They don't have to play a team that's tricky out of the West in a Texas A&M. Their road game in the West is somewhere that they're very familiar with and an opponent that they're very familiar with. So you get that quote unquote tricky game against Ole Miss, you get them at home. I think that is very favorable for Georgia and its chances to go 12-0, make it to Atlanta and potentially three-peat.
Yeah. I like what you said. I mean, when I look at the schedule, I'm not high on Florida. I think theirs was 6.5, and I think that it's not out of the question to take the under on that. I just don't think that they have the talent. When you think Florida, like when you and I think Florida, especially you went to Georgia, I mean, you think, man, that team, no matter how much they're not playing well, they still got a lot of talent. I just don't think they have that much talent. I think they have really putting their chips in that 24 class. The road game at Tennessee, I mean, look, I think you can expect an atmosphere like what Georgia fans watched the Alabama-Tennessee game last year. I think that's exactly what it's going to be like. The Ole Miss game, just for me, is going to be interesting because if Lane Kiffin, if Jackson Dart takes the step as that starting quarterback, a lot of people thought he, who would have that role. If it is Jackson Dart, and he takes the step, but a lot of Ole Miss fans, we had, a great show, and you should check it out if you hadn't already, previewing that Matt Corral did in year 2. Matt Corral was a great quarterback at Ole Miss. By the time you get to November, Ole Miss is going to know a lot about themselves. For me covering LSU, that's kind of their game. You got to go to Ole Miss and beat them before you can worry about beating Alabama. So, but yeah, what you were going to say on that?
Well, and keep in mind, it may not be Jackson Dart, that they've got a ton of talented options there in that quarterback room. I during the offseason did a little bit of a preview on the toughest test that I think Georgia will face, and Ole Miss is one of them. That offense is certainly up there with Tennessee's, and the weapons that they've got, the running back, the transfer receivers that they've got. It's a loaded group that Lane has to work with. And obviously he's a great offensive mind and can create some opportunities for those guys. Another one that I think is getting talked about less than, I think South Carolina gets talked about a lot. And I think that is an intriguing game. I think one that gets talked about less for Georgia in the East, and I might put this as Georgia's, I would probably put Georgia's biggest chance to lose a game at home, I think, would be against Ole Miss. The one that would give it competition would be Kentucky. And the reason I don't say Kentucky is, and we've talked about this on our show, so come check it out over at DawgsHQ. What Georgia does is a very similar scheme to what Michigan and Kentucky does. Georgia is Bud heavy. Michigan is Bud light. And then you've got a Bud Zero version in Kentucky in terms of the talent that they've got.
I'm sure this will be taken all in stride, by the way, your comparison here, but continue. Yes,
exactly. And so, here's what I will say is I think that Kentucky plays Georgia physically. I mean, it's consistently one of the toughest games that Georgia plays. Mark Stoops, again, somebody that's been around this league for a while, understands what it's like to play against a Kirby Smart coach team. It's going to be interesting because they've got talent at wide receiver. They've got a ton of guys returning on that defense. But can they figure it out at quarterback? Much like Ole Miss, we're talking about, these teams that could give Georgia trouble. And you look at the last 5 teams that Georgia has lost to. If I'm not mistaken, the general theme here, and I'm trying to think back. Alabama had a first round Heisman Trophy winning quarterback. 2020, you had so that was 2021. 2020, they lost to Florida, who had a Heisman Trophy finalist quarterback, not a first rounder, but a Heisman Trophy finalist quarterback in Kyle Trask. Mac Jones, who was a first rounder and a Heisman Trophy finalist quarterback. 2019, they lost to South Carolina. Obviously, that was not a great quarterback situation, but Joe Burrow was the other loss, and everyone remembers what that was. Quarterback is the key to beating Georgia. 4 of the last 5 teams, the last 4 teams that have beaten the Dogs, Heisman Trophy finalist quarterbacks.
And you mentioned with Kentucky too. I mean, you get Liam Cohen back for them, and that's huge. And you got a guy in Devin Leary that I watched a lot in the ACC who has, when he stays upright, he can play very well. And so that's going to be a fun matchup. Obviously, them coming into Sanford Stadium. Last question before we get out of here, Palmer.
And I'll wrap it up there is, it all comes back to the quarterbacks. Can Spencer Rattler make that jump in his second year at South Carolina? Can Devin Leary do something that with Liam Cohen that Will Levis did in that first year at Kentucky? I think that's a very similar situation. Does Florida have a quarterback in its transfer group? Graham Mertz being the favorite there to win that job. Ole Miss, they've got quarterbacks and lots of them. And then not Hendon Hooker, replacing Hendon Hooker, Joe Milton, obviously the guy that everyone has circled, was an all SEC third team selection. I think it's the best quarterback that they will play this year. And that's at least in the regular season. And that says more about the schedule than it does Joe Milton.
I don't disagree with you there. I think the Tech fans will disagree with you in saying, what about Haynes King or Zach Pyron? But that's another conversation for another day. Hey, before we get out of here, let's go with this last question. We've talked about the regular season. You look at that schedule, it is what it is. But when you look at the postseason, and just, I mean, this is obviously very, very far away. Kirby Smart would not approve of this question, no doubt about it. Talent wise, on paper, now we're going to know a lot once the season starts. Is there a team that matches up well with Georgia? I mean, look, there's been a lot of conversation about Michigan, the advances they made, all the guys they brought back, and they're chomping at the bit. They have a whole section of practice is literally dedicated to how to beat Georgia. It feels like, and that's true. Alabama. I mean, look, a lot. I sit in the camp, Homer, of yes, Alabama has a question mark at quarterback, but it's Nick Saban, and it kind of feels like he's going to figure it out. Is Georgia still head and shoulders, as we wrap it up here, the most talented team in the country? And is it a wide margin, or are there some programs that you think could give them some trouble?
I don't know. I mean, I do think Georgia is the most talented team out there. I think as you look at the recruiting rankings, Alabama's obviously got a ton of talent in these last couple of classes that they've compiled there. Like you said, question at quarterback, can they get exceptional quarterback play, or can they get, just adequate quarterback play and let the guys around them, do the job? I think if there was one team, I'd shared my thoughts on Michigan already. And I don't think that they match up well against Georgia. The team that matches up best against Georgia is the team that did it last year. And without a missed field goal, they would have beaten Georgia.
Yeah.
Ohio State. And it's those receivers. Obviously they've got to figure out quarterback too. They're replacing number 2 overall pick in CJ Stroud. But I think that with Ryan Day, that system, first of all, I'm confused how they keep losing to Michigan, and that's what they've got to take care of first before they can worry about, beating Georgia and playing Georgia. They've got to figure out how they're going to beat Michigan. But they get in that matchup. I think that's a team that gives Georgia trouble because, again, you look at the teams that have given Georgia trouble over the last couple of years, it's those explosive offenses. It's the 2019 LSU, 2020 Alabama, 2020 Florida, 2021 Alabama. What is the common theme there? It's the Heisman Trophy finalists at quarterback, and it's explosive wide receivers. I don't know that Ohio State has a high at quarterback. We'll wait and see there. But I know one thing, and they've got some really, really explosive receivers.
Yeah, I mean, they're one play away from, in my mind, being the national champions.
Yep. And last year, I thought that there were 3 teams capable of winning a national championship. I don't know if I would put a number on it this year. Last year, I mean, it would have been Alabama. I think that they would have given Georgia some trouble. And keep in mind, they lost 2 games, but it was by a combined 4 points, all on the road.
on the last possession.
On the last play of the game. So, Alabama would have given Georgia trouble because they had talent. And it was Ohio State, and they gave Georgia trouble. We saw it. That Peach Bowl was essentially the national championship game because I don't know how TCU beat Michigan. I don't know how Michigan beat Ohio State because those were the 2 best teams in the country on that field. And I think that there's a chance that those are the 2 best teams in the country again this year, but we'll have to wait and see how things shake out at quarterback, not only in Athens, but Columbus, Tuscaloosa, all around the country. A lot of it comes back to the quarterback play, and it's a really interesting year of quarterbacks because there are some really talented quarterbacks out there, but they may not be on the best teams in the country.
That's a very good point. And one big reason why the folks down here in Baton Rouge do feel confident because they're one of the few programs across the country that not only has 1, but they think 2 guys that could go out and do very well for them. Palmer, appreciate it as always, man. Before we get out of here, look, I know we work for rival companies, but go ahead, promote what you already did once, and I've already done it on the show. Go ahead, tell us where we can find you and where we can find all your work as we get ready for the season.
Yeah, DawgsHQ, part of the On3 network. You can see my Twitter handle there at Palmer Thombs, PalmerThombs. Like I said, we've got a great podcast ourselves that we take some pride in. The Georgia show over at DawgsHQ, Bark After Dark, where we have a little bit of fun there. That one's a little bit more laid back. Georgia show, we break it all down. Sundays and Wednesdays for the Georgia show, Monday nights for Bark After Dark, and DawgsHQ every day of the week.
Absolutely. Well, Palmer, appreciate it as always, man. I know we're ready to get the season going. And, man, best of luck to you in your travel. And who knows, we might meet up in Atlanta at the end of the year, hoping for that LSU Georgia matchup in the SEC title game.
Thanks, Bryce.
That's the Credit Booth Podcast. This has been the Georgia Preview. If you want to check out other previews, make sure to go back into this playlist. Check out on the channel. We got some great content, including a really fun college football revamped NCAA 14 Dynasty that has been a roller coaster of emotions. Yes, it's Georgia Tech, but we're going to be doing some other stuff, including, he doesn't know it yet, playing the Road to Glory career of Ralph Leary. It's going to be a lot of fun. Make sure you check it in. If you're listening on podcast or on radio in Georgia, we appreciate you as well. And make sure to hit that subscribe button, like button, wherever you're getting this content. We'll catch you next time here on the Credit Booth Podcast.